afternoon. My name is Karen Basra. I'm the IoD's Corporate Governance Policy Advisor and Secretary to the IoD Centre for Corporate Governance. Thank you for joining us today for this afternoon's discussion with Sir John Tusa. Before we begin, today's session will be recorded. And if there are sort of any technical hitches or issues, we'll endeavour to fix them as quickly as possible. In terms of format, I'll be putting questions to John for around 40 minutes, and then we'll open to questions from the floor. Please do submit any questions that you have via the Zoom webinar chat that you should be able to see in front of you. I'm sure you're all very well versed with Zoom now, so hopefully we shouldn't have any issues there. I also just quickly wanted to set today's event in context. So as you know, the IoD Centre for Corporate Governance was established earlier this year as a multi-stakeholder hub for the discussion of environmental, social and governance issues. Now we hope that today's event with Sir John is the first of many events organised under the aegis of the Centre, where we hope to invite authors to come and discuss their latest works. So do keep an eye out for future events. So I think that's pretty much everything covered in terms of housekeeping. Obviously don't need to tell anyone where the fire escapes are, which is good. So we're delighted to have Sir John Tusa with us today. Many of you will know Sir John primarily as a broadcaster. John joined the BBC in the 1960s and went on to become one of the first presenters of Newsnight in 1980 when the programme first aired. He also presented BBC News at 1 for a couple of years in the 1990s, but at the BBC went on to become Managing Director of BBC World Service. But it's not in the context of John being a broadcaster that we're having today's discussion. It's in his role as an arts administrator, and we're reflecting on his book On Board, which has recently been released, which reflects on his time at the National Portrait Gallery, Public Radio International, the English National Opera, the University of the Arts London, the British Museum, the Claw Leadership Programme, and Wigmore Hall. So, Sir John, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, I mean, I thought we'd begin really with how you sort of first became a director and how you came to be on the board of the National Portrait Gallery.
Yes, it's, I think, salutary to go back. That was 1988. And believe me, the governance world was very, very different in 1988. I think it's a whole lot better now. But at the time I was working at the BBC World Service, which had its offices at Bush House in the Strand. And I got a phone call from the then director of the National Portrait Gallery, a man called John Hayes, who said, would I like to come in and have a chat, and would I like to become a trustee of the National Portrait Gallery? Well, I thought, I know nothing about portraits. I know nothing about the history of portraiture. I've never been involved with a gallery, but if somebody asks you along for a cup of coffee, you go along. So I went along, I had a chat, and he said that, of course, they would want advice about perhaps media and presentation matters. And that seemed to me to be a reasonable ground for joining the board. I have to say that in the 12 years that I was on the board, I don't think I was ever asked for my advice on how the National Portrait Gallery should present itself. And there is a lesson there, which perhaps we can discuss later. It's also reminded that in those days, being asked to join a board was a remarkably casual affair. There it was one conversation with the director. And was there any sort of induction? No. I had to find out roughly what the National Portrait Gallery did, which I did. I joined, and from thereafter it was an enormous learning process, because I experienced what happens when a board really stands up and makes up its mind that it wants to do something. It was a very, I can explain that later if you want, it was a very salutary experience, and I was very lucky to have it.
Yeah, and John, I think, in the book you talk about the sort of broader context of what was kind of going on at the time broadly in governance when you joined. You talk about the sort of Whitehall managerial revolution, where kind of the Thatcher government had insisted that arts organisations really get a handle on their own buildings, and look after things and manage the organisations. And I think the impression that you get was that before this kind of so-called revolution, arts organisations were really a little bit sleepy, and I think then had to become slightly more business-like. Do you think that's a fair characterisation? I just wonder whether you could talk a little bit about that revolution.
Yes, absolutely. Boards in those days, I'm talking about the 80s and the 90s, and the process of change started to take place in the 90s, certainly because of the new demands of Whitehall. And if I take the case of the British Museum, which I went on to be a trustee later, there's a story that on one occasion, the director of the British Museum was having talks with officials at whatever the relevant department was, and they asked him for some thoughts about his plans and the numbers and etc., and he gathered his papers together and stood up and said, and he didn't expect to be questioned in this way, and left the room. Now, that was, I mean, he was, by the by, in every other respect, a great director. But boards had to learn, and organizations had to learn, not that they were businesses. This is an absolutely crucial distinction. Arts organizations, or not-for-profit organizations, are not businesses, because they have to run on values and principles as well, but they do have to be businesslike. And certainly, over the 25 years that I was on these main boards, the lesson that you really had to run the organization properly was well and truly, and sometimes painfully, learned. But after all, in the end, every organization that I sat on, and others, was much better for being better run, because you had control over your finances. You weren't being pushed from pillar to post. And so by the late 1990s, early 2000s, I think that lesson had been well and truly learned. It's not always consistently learned, and boards are always making mistakes, and organizations are making mistakes, but they know that they have to take responsibility.
I mean, you talk about sort of Whitehall getting involved in various stages, throughout the book, and at the BM you talk about government actually directly appointing people to the board of the British Museum. I just wonder, there's clearly a distinction between public funding and private funding. And I just wondered if you could discuss some of the challenges that come with being reliant on public money, and the expectations then that government and other arm's length organisations like the Arts Council then place upon organisations.
Yes, the word arm's length is absolutely crucial, by the by. And if you are arm's length, then you ought to not to be interfered in by whether it's the Arts Council or the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, or even the Treasury. And most of the time, officials understand this. As far as the British Museum is concerned, bear in mind, the Board of Trustees was set up more than 250 years ago, and the way in which the Board of 25 Trustees is gathered was set out there under Act of Parliament, and some of the people are appointed by the government, but the Board has the responsibility for choosing its own chair and for choosing a handful of its own trustees. This, on the whole, works very well, but as Neil McGregor, former director of the British Museum, said, he said, we are not, that's the British Museum, we are accountable to Parliament. We're not accountable to the government, because we're set up by Act of Parliament. And the Act of Parliament demands that you are independent. The chairman of the British Museum, Niall Fitzgerald, who was a very high-powered businessman, was chairman, chief executive of Unilever, he once said to a civil servant who I think was being a little pressing, he said, "Let me tell you something." He said, "There is nothing that you, the civil service, can give me that I want. There's nothing that you, civil service or politicians, can do to me that I mind. Nothing will stop me from maintaining the independence of the organization." And that is absolutely crucial. And all the great organizations, of which the British Museum is certainly one, keep that independence while being accountable to Parliament. And that's, I think, some people find that a difficult distinction. I don't. MacGregor was insistent on it. You answer to Parliament, and that's very different from answering to a minister.
Yeah, I mean, you touched there on sort of the chair and the director of the British Museum, Niall Fitzgerald and Neil MacGregor. And in the book, I mean, that sounds like a partnership that really works. I think somebody you talk to kind of describes it as a perfect relationship as there could be between those two roles. I mean, that's a kind of relationship that comes up again and again, that of chair and CEO throughout the book. In one portion, you talk about Ken Dayton at PRI and the fact in his role as chair, he liked to bring his CEO to the board and they'd have mutual reviews in front of the board. I mean, that sounds like a really sort of interesting experience. And I think you've certainly got to be a particular character to be up for that. But I just wonder if, you know, witnessing that, what you felt, but also, you know, whether you could emulate that in other organizations and whether you've ever attempted to.
That particular experience, Ken Dayton, by the by, for fellow participants, was the chairman of a very large American retail company called the Dayton Hudson Corporation of the Twin Cities. And he was not only a stickler on governance, and by his great word, his great motto was governance is governance and management is management, and they don't interfere with one another, they reinforce. And by the by, his other great saying about the relationship between chair and CEO was, it is a relationship of partnership but separation. That is, we are partners until the time that I may have to sack you. And that is an absolutely essential part of the relationship. Difficult. Now, examining one another's performance before the full board. I only saw this once, and I must say my breath was absolutely taken away. Just imagine in, you know, whoever is here, imagine in your organization that in your board, the chair and the CEO report on how they think the other person is doing their job vis-a-vis them. It is, by general experience, a very scary activity. I don't know many organizations that actually have the guts to do it. As I sat watching this, by the by, I was at the time on the BBC Board of Management. And at that time, the relationship between the Director General of the BBC and the chair of the BBC was notoriously bad, notoriously bad. And I thought, can I imagine the BBC having a session like this? I just couldn't. I think that was an extreme form of accountability, a rather wonderful one, but there you are, it happened. Maybe you might want to try it once, but I think there are other ways of making sure that the chair and the CEO get on. But that was very, very rigorous, and that came to me from my great American guru, Ken Dayton.
It sounds to me as though, you know, you need to have particular qualities to be able to sort of withstand that kind of activity. And it seems to me that humility is really one that stands out in being able to be that self-effacing. I wonder what other qualities you think a good chair ought to have.
Just about the humility, looking at Niall Fitzgerald, the chair of the British Museum, and Neil McGregor, one of the things that people said about Niall Fitzgerald, he'd run Unilever. Financially, but the British Museum was neither here nor there. Financially, in complexity, he said it's an incredibly complex organization. But people said the thing about Niall was that he was very humble in the face of the organization, because he knew that it was about scholarship and 250 years of scholarship and knowledge and inquiry. And that was something that was actually outside his own experience. So he brought humility to it, and that was a very, very important part of it. McGregor had to as well in a different way. For myself, I think patience is very important, but the most important thing, and I said to a number of chief executives whom I worked with, I said, listen, there's one rule that we go by. You, my chief executive, will hear it from me first. You will never hear gossip about what I think or what I'm saying behind your back, because I won't. And I don't. I won't even talk to other members of the board. I suppose I might if I was going to have to dismiss somebody. But essentially, that trust, you always hear it from me first. And that means that you have to share the difficult things and the less good things as well as the good ones. I had a wonderful chief executive at the Wigmore Hall, John Gilhooly, who is still there doing an extraordinary job. And he said, I always remember, I could ring you up, me, at any time and say, I think I'm a bit worried about this. Now, that might not have turned out to be a problem, but he was always very good at talking about it and warning me first. It's much better to warn rather than say, my God, something awful has happened. So absolute trust. And, I had one very, very painful experience on English National Opera when the general director, a man called Dennis Marks, who's a very great friend, he regularly didn't tell his chairman what the financial numbers were. And that broke the organization, and that broke him as well, especially when the numbers don't work. And by the by, when Dennis Marks took over the English National Opera, he was advised by his predecessor, don't tell the board anything. So that also pitches you back in the 1980s and early 1990s, that anybody could think that you shouldn't share problems and information with your board. There may be some organizations where that still happens now, and if that is the case, then they are in for trouble. But trust, you don't have to be the same kind of person at all, but the trust has to be there. Can I just say, I had a marvelous relationship with the Vice Chancellor at the University of the Arts London, who was a lawyer called Nigel Carrington, and somebody said, you, me, and Nigel Carrington got on very well because you were very different. He said, you came from a journalistic background, and so the moment you saw an opportunity, you wanted to do it. He came from a legal background, so when there was an opportunity, he said, how can we do this properly? So I was always saying, go faster, and he was saying, but let's do it right. So we were complementary, very different, but complementary, and absolute trust.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And John, I think you say in the book at one point, the chair and the director should never be cut from the same cloth. I think is the phrase that you use. Just going back to something that you said earlier, I think you spoke a little bit about John Gilhooly and your time at Wigmore Hall. You say in the book that John was only sort of 28 when he was appointed. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on sort of younger directors and how, people perhaps in their late 20s, early 30s can be brought onto boards, and what might be needed so that we can see more of that.
Yes. When I was at the Barbican, probably in the late 90s, this was, and I was very interested in this question of getting they happen to be my son's generation of people. And there were some very interesting and I thought very able people there, late 30s, perhaps early 40s. And I thought I'm going to encourage them to get on boards because I learned so much from it. And I think that's one of the great things about being on a board. It's a learning experience for you. It really, really is. And so I got together about 20 of that generation, let's say late 30s then, late 30s, early 40s. And I tried to explain what the advantages or what the benefits of joining a board would be for them. And they listened and they said, yes, we absolutely agree, but do remember that we're at an early-ish stage of our career or at a particularly demanding stage of our career. Many of them were had families, and they said, honestly, we don't have time. Now, I accepted that at the time. What I did say was, don't forget this, and actually seek out opportunities later on when you feel that you do have a bit of time, because people like you should. It is a way of giving back to the community, but above all, it's something where you learn and you'll expand your experience of organizations, because you'll go on to organizations which are very different from the ones that you work in. And so it's a mutual benefit thing. You contribute and you learn. And I think that is all I can do. Actually, I know that at the Roundhouse, the Arts Centre in Northwest London, they've had for some time a very good system of having youth trustees, and they are early 20s, that sort of thing. But they put them on knowingly, and I think they're on for maybe 1 or 2 years, but they are there to learn, and by all accounts they do, but their presence is so valuable. And maybe there's an additional category of trustee which it's worth having for boards, people who are brought on specifically because they, not so much they represent something, but they represent a different age group.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing that a lot of members of the IoD have often got in contact about is the idea of a sort of shadow board, where you do have younger members who are shadowing other board members, and that sounds as though that's what's going on at the Roundhouse. I think one thing that I'm really interested in more broadly is board composition, and you describe lots of different boards in the book. I think there's the Museum of Fine Art in Chicago that you described that has 80 board members, which is it's an American board, and I think the idea there is that lots of those people are donors and contribute, but also want to have some sort of role in governance of those organisations. But in the UK, you also talk about the board of the British Museum, which at the time was very large, but you sort of suggest that there was individuals on board who could play particular roles. It wasn't that the board would always act as a whole. And there's one particularly nice anecdote in the book about Bonnie Greer and the Elgin Marbles. I wonder if you're
Yes. What happened, and what in a sense still happens, is that from time to time politicians say to the British government, we want the Parthenon sculptures back, and the British government, if it's sensible, says, I'm sorry, it's nothing to do with us, they belong to the British Museum. The British Museum is independent under an Act of Parliament. But this is an issue which keeps on coming up. And in the time of Niall Fitzgerald as chairman, he got an invitation to go to the opening of the new museum in Athens. And the new museum in Athens has rooms dedicated to where they would like to put the Parthenon sculptures. So Niall thought, what do I do? And he said, oh, fine, I'll say to the Greeks, I'm terribly sorry, I can't come, but may I send one of the vice chairs of the British Museum so that we can be properly represented. And the Greeks said, yes, of course, we'd be delighted to welcome a vice chair of the British Museum. One of the vice chairs of the British Museum was Bonnie Greer, who is, as she describes herself, a black American playwright from South Chicago. And so when she appeared in Athens, there wasn't a lot that the Greeks could say about colonial exploitation or anything like that. Bonnie, of course, played a blinder, but that showed how you can use, I mean, the board has overall responsibility, but individual members are terribly, terribly useful as well. Collectively, the board has to act, but individually, every board member has a role to play, very often because the chief executive or the chair can consult them. Neil McGregor was always talking to individual trustees. That's the point. It's a sort of brains trust, but the decisions are taken collectively.
Yeah. And I think, you know, with the British Museum, you talk about how a sort of antiquated structure from sort of 1753 had meant that board meetings were, you know, on a Saturday, but there was 9 of them a year. And you suggest in the book that this was to do with a long lost sort of Archbishop of Canterbury. But I think, you know, you sort of suggest that having all those meetings had restricted the people that could participate on that board. And by reducing that number of meetings, you were able to bring more people in. I wonder if you'd just touch on that quickly.
Yes. It's perfectly clear that you couldn't expect a board of 25 to deal with the complexity of all the issues which the British Museum had, or any organization like that, has to deal with. Therefore, you have to find a way. And by the way, when I began, we had hundreds of pages of board papers beforehand, hundreds. And incidentally, at the University of the Arts, London, later, my vice chancellor, a lawyer, was appalled by the fact, he said that there could be 1,000 pages of documents before a meeting of the Court of Governors. This is ludicrous. Going back to the British Museum, we had to find a way of dealing with, let's call them the fiduciary responsibilities, accounts, the law, HR, governance, things like that. You have to set up a proper system of committees. They will be staffed by half a dozen people, and that business, you know, that business will be done before the main board meets. So the main board can note them, maybe can question them as well, but then can deal with the big issues which they are there to do. And that also meant that you weren't asking distinguished people internationally. One of the people we had was Emeka Anyaoku, who used to be Secretary General of the Commonwealth. There was a limit to the number of times he could come. 4 meetings a year was something, and the fact that he could be consulted. So you spread the responsibility to individual committees. They come together, 4 meetings a year, and that is when the British Museum trustees acted as the responsible body. And that then worked. And you know, one of the things I point out in the book is that it took 10 years to move from the situation where the board was absolutely inundated with paper to one where it had the new streamlined system, which is not less effective, it's much more effective and much more accountable. That incidentally was devised by John Brown, Lord Brown of BP. That works terribly well.
Just sort of staying on the British Museum, I'm sorry to sort of spend so much time on it. It just was the case study that I think was the most interesting. There's sort of a discussion in there about sort of mission and purpose. And, you know, we talked earlier about the fact that, you know, with the British Museum, you would often get people asking for things back. Various artifacts, you spoke about the Greeks there. But this sort of articulation of the museum's mission as a museum of the world, for the world, and you talk about Neil McGregor sort of coming up with that. I just wonder what the board's role ought to be in defining mission and purpose for an organisation. And I think a related question is, you talk in the book about the American public radio institution that you were involved in, and how their mission changed and they became Public Radio International. So firstly, what if a director comes up with a very well articulated mission, should the board sort of seek to interrogate it? And secondly, if there's a degree to which the mission or purpose of an organization changes and is expanded, what role should the board play in sort of questioning that?
The mission statement, or the mission phrase of the British Museum, was illuminating world cultures. And there it was on every piece of paper. And every time I saw it, something died in me, because I thought it was a really boring, bureaucratic thing, something that had probably, and I apologize to anybody listening, had been dreamed up by a series of committees and maybe a series of outside consultants. I thought it was dead behind the eyes. And from time to time I said, we really have to have a better statement and expression and logo of what we are for. And in my recollection, Neil McGregor came up with Museum of the World for the World. And we were also staggered, and all in my case, I was so delighted. We said, frankly, Neil, that's it. That's it. Now, by the way, it's the job of the executive to dream up the strategy and the mission statement. Boards interrogate them, examine them, sometimes might overturn them, but boards cannot devise the strategy. Somebody had told me at the Barbican, when I was managing director, that the City of London Corporation would tell me what the artistic mission of the Barbican was. I've said, I'm terribly sorry, you're not qualified to do that. And the same thing with the BM. Neil McGregor came up with the idea. That was so brilliant. And I don't recall any discussion, simply because it really was one of those things where everybody recognized it was what we were about. I'm not sure that happens very often, but it's marvelous when it does. So the executive has to produce the idea, and boards should certainly say if they think that a mission statement is boring. And let's face it, most mission statements, because people have been told how to draw them up, are boring. And I would invite everybody who thinks that they are in an organization which has a mission statement which is too long and which doesn't actually express the spirit of the organization that they are part of, to say, let's start again, let's do it again, and let's find something that represents us. And just one final thing about a museum of the world for the world. What McGregor said was, most museums, many museums and galleries are nationalist organizations. National. The great thing about the British Museum and the other great museums is that they are global. They are international. Their remit is not a national remit. And that seems to be, especially in present circumstances, immensely valuable. Sorry, have I answered all things you wanted about the question?
So yeah. I think the other question that was sort of wrapped up in there was around Public Radio International and yes. How it went from being a sort of,
sorry, that again, I think it was slightly after my time, but that was a different approach. I mean, that was also executive led, because the environment in which Public Radio International was working, the American public broadcasting environment was changing so much that American Public Radio, then Public Radio International, had to change what it did. So its terms of reference were led by the executive responding to a change in the circumstances in which they worked. And I think the board and the trustees no doubt questioned it and thought, yes, that is right, but it was executive led.
Sure. Because I mean, I think, one of the earlier case studies in the book is about the National Portrait Gallery. And they have lots of sort of great successes. And then there's talk of setting up sort of regional outposts and things like that. And the board warns of kind of imperial overreach. And I wonder, how often a board does have to kind of rein in an executive when there's a danger that it's creeping away from its mission?
I think quite often, and there is a temptation when an organization starts to be successful, and we had this at the Barbican, where suddenly people were coming along and saying, oh, could we join? And I know at the University of the Arts London, organizations in my time, a number of smaller arts colleges, arts universities would come along and say, my goodness, you seem to have got a certain answer to how organizations like this work. Can we join? And I think we always said, no, you can't, because it was very hard to bring together 6 art colleges within London, never mind taking in others outside. So when you're successful, and the UAL was successful, and the Barbican was successful, and the National Portrait Gallery was successful, that's the time when you say, yes, but where are we successful? We are successful in a particular area, in a particular place, and we don't just extend and build, because people say we're good. It's a sort of aspect of institutional vanity. You don't you don't say, yeah, let's take them all on. We can improve them. No. Stick to where you are good. Sure.
We're kind of drawing to the end of our time, and I do want to leave time for audience questions. There was one final question which I had meant to start with, but we'll get to it now. And it was really, there's lots of discussion in the book, and there's lots of interviews and comments from people that you served alongside on various boards. And it seems to me that the comments are very sort of candid and honest. And I just wondered what the process was when writing the book.
The book was always going to be about what being on boards involves, using the experience, not just my experience, but the experience of my colleagues, of the people with whom I sat on boards. Of the 7 organizations, so probably we're talking about 80 or 90 people, maybe slightly more, every single person whom I contacted and said, this is what I'm doing, will you talk to me? Can we have a chat about what we did on the board of that organization at the time? And all bar 2 said yes. And the reason that I think people wanted to speak and were happy to speak and spoke very frankly, as you say, is that on the whole, you don't have time, you're not given time, particularly when you leave a board, to think and to reflect on what happened. And I think that going back to my colleagues and saying, let's talk about some of the awful times on English National Opera or whatever, that it was a relief. Once I'd started talking to people, and it was obvious that nobody was pulling their punches, time incidentally helps. We are talking very often about things 10, 15 years ago. We're sometimes talking about people who are no longer with us. But essentially, I think it shows that being on a board it's a big activity, it's a demanding activity, and therefore the opportunity to talk about it and to think about it and to talk about it in public was something which all these people welcomed. Incidentally, I then showed them what they said, and I showed everybody how I used their quotes in the chapters. So if they were frank, and they could see how their quotes were being used. So it's about the experience of boards. And somebody said, is this a book about governance? I said, of course it's a book about governance, but it is a book about the lived experience of governance, told through, in some cases, in the case of English National Opera, I think a tragic story which affected at least 1, 2, or 3 people's careers in a major way, some of them in a completely conclusive way. The consequences of being on boards where things go wrong are sometimes very painful. That's not a reason for not taking it on.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds almost as though you're describing sort of exit interviews or something like that. I wonder whether you've taken any of what you've learnt back to those organisations.
Taking the lessons back.
Yeah.
Did you say? Yeah. Well, three of the organisations are now giving the book to new trustees or new board members. And are saying, as part of your induction, you should read this book, and in particular, you should read the chapter about BMENO or University of the Arts before you join this board. I said to somebody, are you sure it won't put would-be trustees off? And they said no. So if it is part of a general learning process, I'm absolutely delighted. And one of the things in the book, as you know, is that at the end of each chapter, I pull together what I call reflections, which just, what are some of the lessons and observations that I make of what happened on that board. Some of them, of course, are in common. Many are different. There are lessons to be drawn. It's not a governance rule book, but I do hope that people will learn about the actual lived experience of being on a board. It's worth doing, but it can be very tough.
So I think actually that sort of notion of induction onto board links quite nicely with Ian's question here. So you mentioned that the process for director appointments kind of back when you first started was quite informal, going for coffee at the Athenaeum or whatever it was. Yeah. To what extent do you think that the professionalisation of appointments has led to more effective directors?
Oh, I think much more. At the University of the Arts London, where we were very concerned to get all sorts of balances right, gender balance, diversity, and so on. And we just talked about it very much more. So I said, look, we need one more member of the court, two more members of the court. I really want suggestions from members of the court. You just have to work at it rather harder. And then we would look at the skill set and so on and so forth. And then we would interview very, very thoroughly. And it enormously improved the range of people that we had on the court and the quality of the discussions. Nobody was there, as it were, on an automatic basis. So I'm entirely in favor of that. One of my colleagues on the CLAW leadership program, a man called Farooq Chowdhury, who's the executive director of the Akram Khan Dance Company. And Farooq said to me, we spend as much time choosing trustees and chairmen as we do choosing dancers. So I think that's how professional you need to be. An organization looks at itself, says, what situation are we in? What do we now want to do? Who do we need? Who would we value on the board to help us do this? Take time, think hard. And although heaven knows, again, in the old days, how did you join a board? Because somebody recommended you because they sat on another board with you. Tom Phillips, the artist, said to me, he said, we're just rugger balls. We just get passed from one organization to another. That was what it was like. It's much less like that now, and it should be much less like that now.
So I've got another question here, John, from Andrew. So we did mention the MFA in Chicago having that board of 80. I just wonder on the back of that, what size should a board be? What's the optimal size for decision making? And do you think that board in Chicago could make decisions effectively? I know you weren't serving on it, but it is one that you discuss.
Well, the American boards, of which I don't have that experience, but Malcolm Rogers, who I spoke to about it, and who was a very successful director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, he said that there were real limitations in having a board like that. And that's partly because American institutions like having lots of rich people on the board. Fine, that's how they do it. But the trouble with having rich people on the board is that they confuse being responsible for it with being a stakeholder, and a stakeholder thinks they can interfere. And with money, in the case of a large American board, came a sense of entitlement. I'm rich, I give money, I probably give them pictures, and so on and so forth. I contribute to this fund and that fund, and therefore I have some sort of special right to have my opinions acknowledged. That is very difficult. You don't have that sort of right. 70 is far, far too much. British Museum at 25, it had to work very hard to find a structure for making that 25 work properly. At the University of the Arts, I started with a university court, the overall supervisory body, of about 32, 33. It was a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. It had far too many academics on it and far too many union representatives. And union representative couldn't understand that they were there to look at the interest of the university as a whole. So we cut that down to about 18, most of whom were outsiders. And 18 worked very, very, very well. And you can staff all the committees with that. And by the by, if anybody ever says to you, oh, join this board, it's just 4 meetings and a away day, don't join that board. A, because that's untrue, and B, even if it was true, it's not worth being on a board where that is all you do. The more you can do, the better it is. But so a board about 15, 16, something like that, are people who are really committed to what that organization needs. Anything over 20, difficult. 70, totally different. Absolutely not. But it's, you know, that's the American way.
Yeah. There's a question here about, so I mean, obviously we've spoken about arts organisations, and that's where your experience lies. But also, you know, academia, where you've been at the University of Arts, London. There's somebody here asking about sort of high-profile governance failures in sports organisations, and I wonder whether you have any lessons that you think sport ought to learn.
Sorry, about the nature of their governance.
Yeah.
Well, by the by, when you said that a lot of the lessons in the book, clearly they are about arts organisation or cultural organisations or non-for-profit organisations. My great American guru, Ken Dayton, a businessman, and Ken said there is no difference in governance between a for-profit organisation and a not-for-profit organisation. And incidentally, anybody who thinks that arts organisations are easy to run and easy to sit on the board, you have another lesson coming. A very powerful merchant banker I sat on the board of English National Opera with, and we went through all sorts of problems. And he once said, you know, running an opera company is one of the most difficult things you can do. He said, working in a bank's easy. An opera company, there's so many complexities. And both John Brown and David Norgrove, who's the director of Marks and Spencer, said the complexity of layers of responsibility that you have in the British Museum are more difficult than in corporates. So the idea that there's something soft about arts boards, or there aren't lessons that each can't learn from the other, that is absolutely not true. What you need, you have to be very careful about specialists. I think this is in relation to sports, perhaps sports organizations. It's certainly true of the arts. A cultural board which is filled with cultural practitioners won't work. They're far too close to it. You need objectivity, distance, and people who can look at the big picture and say, that appears to be right, that appears not to be right. Just because it's a sports organization doesn't mean, say, that you can only have footballers or tennis players. One of the worst experiences a friend of mine had was that he chaired the board of the Minnesota Airline Regulation Board. He's a lawyer, no, he's a businessman. And the board was filled with pilots. And he said, it was an absolute nightmare because they spent their time talking about how you land at this particular airport. He said, and they couldn't get their heads out of the technicalities In other words, they were completely unsuited to being on a board. This is why in a university, you only have a very limited number of academics on the board, not because they aren't admirable, not because they aren't clever. They're not there to represent academics. You need people who will think about the organization differently. And I suspect with the arts organization, with sports organizations rather, you need high-level generalists. What I say to people is, you may well be invited onto a board for a particular skill. A board will have on it particular skills, accountancy, HR, law, that sort of thing. But anybody on a board is there for their common sense. You're not there just as a lawyer or as an accountant or as a media expert. You have to look at everything. And I suspect the same thing goes for sports organizations, because, you know, the issues are big issues. They're issues which affect society, and general people with general intelligence and sympathy for the activity are the people that you want, rather than somebody who's won a championship or run the fastest mile or anything like that. Not that there isn't a role for them, but you need the generalists as well. So I would suggest the lesson for sports organizations is the same as for cultural ones. You don't pack a museum board with artists.
John, I just wonder on that. You know, under the last government, well, under the last Prime Minister, under Theresa May, you know, there was a big push to get workers represented on boards. I mean, you know, that hasn't happened in the way that I think was expected. I just wondered, you know, from that perspective, that board members ought to be sort of disinterested. You know, how you feel about the idea of workers on boards?
I'm very, very skeptical of it. Again, going back to some of my American experience, where what was drummed into me was, you have to be objective. If you have an interest, a personal interest in the activity of the organization, you cannot by definition be on the supervisory regulatory board. Of course, consultation, but if the board is there, the consultation with the interest group is there, and there probably should be more of it. But you know, I certainly found at the University of the Arts London that having union representatives and staff representatives on the Court of Governors was such a block, because they never understood. They never understood that they were looking at the whole organization. They were looking at the interest of a particular group, and that is what you don't do. So I'm very, very, very skeptical about that. I know the Germans manage it. I don't know how, but I've never seen it work in the direct experience I have. You know, for example, the Board of English National Opera, we usually had 1 or 2 opera singers on it. Lovely to have them, great people, but they always found it difficult to step back and to look at the total picture of English National Opera.
That's helpful. So I think one of the themes that we spoke about a little bit earlier was younger directors. There's a question here from Janice about sort of when you do go out and recruit for trustees, you know, normally you're looking for contacts or you're looking for particular skills. And what that tends to do is it precludes younger applicants. Do you think that not-for-profit organisations ought to have a sort of obligation to recruit at least one young person or perhaps a first-timer on a board? Do you think that would help build a pool of talent?
Yes, I mean, I think the example of the Roundhouse is a very interesting one, and it clearly works for them. And I think what I'd say is that if any board felt that they would get a better range of thoughts and ideas about what the organization was doing by having an additional category, I think it might be unfair to very young people to say you're a trustee. You know, that's has all sorts of legal and fiduciary implications. But if they thought that by having an additional category related maybe to age, that would work, that would be up to that particular board. So I'm certainly not ruling it out. I wouldn't make it, I think every board is so different. Every board needs to decide how they work. But I think it's a good idea, just as, gender has become something we thought about, we know about, and we didn't so much 20 years ago. Diversity, ditto. So the youth balance is probably something that we can think about more, but I'm very reluctant to say, you will always do this, because it might not always be right.
Yeah, just on sort of, mandatory measures, it seems to me that in governance, when we talk about it, there's a lot around kind of compliance and as you say, those duties and responsibilities. Do you think there's a danger that sort of scares off potential applicants?
Yes, but the legal responsibilities and the responsibilities put on a board by the Charity Commission are there for a very good reason, and they have to be looked at. What people sometimes ignore is that you're also financially responsible. Towards the end of my time in English National Opera, when there was a financial crisis of some kind or another almost every year, and the number of times we said to our QC on the board, we said, are you satisfied, in the light of the information you've been given, that we are not trading insolvently? Because after all, if you trade insolvently, and you are shown to be trading insolvently, then you can be, that is, I think it's a criminal action, and you would be disqualified from ever sitting on a board again. So you have to ask these questions, and at least one other organization, we always said, are we trading at Wigmore Hall? There was one particular period that we looked very hard at the numbers and said, are we about to start trading insolvently? And we weren't. It was a pretty close call. So one of the things is it's about asking questions. And if you're worried about something, are we breaking this act? Are we breaking that act? At least ask the question and make sure that it's answered properly. One of my friends said, what I think every director, every board member rather, should ask themselves after a board meeting is, did I ask the right questions? Did I ask the tough questions? Did I ask the tough questions in a collegiate way? But if you come out of a board meeting, thinking, I really should have asked about this, that, and the other, then you are not actually doing your job. And also, by the way, there are no stupid questions, and particularly about money. If a particular line in a budget looks peculiar, it probably is, and you don't have to be an accountant to see it. So ask the questions and ask what you might think is a stupid question. So I'm terribly sorry, I'm not an accountant, but I don't understand that line. 9 times out of 10, no. A remarkable number of times out of 10, they'll say, oh yes, there is a bit of a problem there. So be brave, because otherwise it's not sitting on a board. It's not worth doing.
On the topic of questions, I just wondered whether there were any other audience questions, because you'll have to get them in sharp, because we're coming up to our 1:30 deadline. Let me just give that a second. It doesn't look as though there's any questions coming in, John. So there was just one final question that I had. Talking about insolvency, we're obviously at a point, in the pandemic where lots of arts organisations are struggling. I wonder how you see the future of the arts in that context.
I would be, I can't pretend that, let us talk about performance, and not of performance arts, performance events. If the financial model, as it does, of any public performance event, it doesn't matter where it lies in the spectrum of the arts, depends on your getting 85% capacity of your venue. And now suddenly you can only have 15%, 20%. I'm terribly sorry, the business model is bust. And until and somehow we get round that, I just don't know what the answer is. I don't think anybody does. And no, I'm afraid from that point of view, it's no different from the hospitality industry.
No.
The hospitality industry, you need people in the bar, you need people in the restaurant, you need people in the cafe. If they're not there, the business model changes. The business model disappears. And incidentally, a friend said the other day, you know, we've spent 25 years making the arts earn more money, be more commercial, all these other things, get more sponsorship. And now what happens? This financial model is broken at almost every level. Box office, no. Sponsorship, no. Hospitality, no. Corporate, no. All these things have gone. And heaven knows how we get through the next few months, because the reserves will have run out long before then. So I wish I could be more cheerful, but I can't. I think one has to be realistic.
I think you're supposed to sort of end an event like this on a positive note. So maybe that was the wrong question to end on. But John, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time. And I think, you know, we covered an awful lot of ground there. I think, you know, the key point that you sort of emphasized again and again is, you know, governance is governance, whether that's in an arts organization, in a charity, or in a sporting organization. I just wondered whether you had any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with today.
No, I would, I think, just emphasize that being on a board, it's a very taxing business, and it can be very rewarding. It can be very painful. I was talking to a very good friend only last night who'd been through a very painful and unsuccessful experience on a particular board. He had been losing sleep for weeks over it. That's the downside. But you accept that responsibility, because when you get things right, as we did over 10 years at the British Museum, as we certainly did at the University of the Arts, as we did at the Wigmore Hall, the satisfaction of knowing that you faced problems, you looked at them hard, and then you overcame them through the proper deployment of governance, that is very, very satisfying. And that's also why I think that so many people were happy to talk in the book, because there were things they were happy, they were satisfied to talk about. There was something fulfilling that they'd been through, even when it had been painful.
There we are. That's our positive thought to end on then. Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, John.
Thank you very much, Karen. It's been a great pleasure being with you all. Thank you for your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you to our audience as well.